Go forth, become a transcendent one. Rise beyond the fate bestowed upon you. And I shall shed a tear at the end of time, as I gaze back upon your life.
Have you ever wondered why Klee loves treasure? I mean, sure, who doesn't? But Klee is a little extra. Her story quest is called True Treasure. She is always asking the Traveler about treasure. She even buries her treasure right here in Mondstadt. Interesting. You know what other fantasy race happens to really love treasure?
Klee, just like Mom, you are of a race blessed with longevity. For us, time is like a gust of wind. Moments come and end.
A long-lived race, Well, Hoyoverse, you cheeky rascals, I'll give you that much. You pulled a quick one on me this whole time. Klee and Alice are elves. Or, that's what we thought. You see, Klee is an extremely old character, as in terms of release date, she is second only to Barbatos. And due to the extreme lack of information back then, for the longest time, the vast majority of people have always assumed that she, and by extension her mother Alice, are elves. I mean, come on, back then Genshin had all the hallmarks of a standard medieval fantasy game with knights, dragons, and castles, and so on. Thus, Klee being an elf is an automatic given since elves are amongst the most iconic species of the fantasy genre in general. However, following the end of Masquerade of the Guilty, when the Traveler inquires Neuvillette about the Dragons of Natlan, the latter says that they are unlike the ancient dragons such as himself due to having evolved over thousands of years of intermingling with humans. Here, I want to point your attention to Neuvillette's ears, which are semi-long and pointy. Therefore, based on the process of genetic variation and mutation, it isn't far-fetched that the evolved Dragons of Natlan have developed different features to those of the ancient dragons, namely elf-like long pointy ears. Notice how neither Klee, Alice, nor Layla are ever referred to as elves despite their elf-like appearance. Instead, Alice says that they belong to a long-lived race. And make no mistake, this is not the first time we see such a concept from Hoyoverse, because in their other game, Honkai Star Rail, the Vidyadhara of the Xianzhou also happen to be elf-like dragons that are dubbed as a long-life species. And what's crazy is that the developers were not misleading us. Believe it or not, these absolute Giga Chad writers at Hoyoverse left us clues about this since the start of the game. Because notice how the poster child of Natlan, Ian-san, has long pointy ears, indicating that she is just like Klee. Now, if you think that everything I just laid out is insanity, then oh boy, get yourselves ready for the absolute level of madness that is about to come later. Trust me, we are just getting started. And you know what? Might as well call me the Miz, because I came to play, and there is a price to pay. Alright everyone, you can find spoiler warnings in the description, and without dragging on, get it? Dragging on, like dragging on the intro, which I'm doing right now. Okay, let's just get started. Before we begin, I must first address the question that everyone must be thinking about. And that is, did Klee hatch from an egg? I'm kidding, I'm just kidding guys, it's just a joke. You know me guys, you know me. But don't worry, because I know exactly what the most important question on everyone's mind right now is. Which obviously, did the rooster Pulcinella hatch out from an egg? Look, I swear to God, if this theory turns out to be true and Pulcinella is called the rooster as a pun on the fact that he is an evolved dragon, while chickens share a common evolutionary ancestor with dinosaurs, who, you know, are the closest thing that nature has to mythical dragons, then I'm gonna go out on a long walk and contemplate Hoyoverse's writing decisions. At any rate, the reason I gave you the answer for as to what Klee's species is up front is because I have another intention behind this video, and it has to do with answering a long-standing mystery that has perplexed me, as I am sure many others, for longer than Klee has been officially released, which is the story behind the Gnostic Chorus of the Battle Pass. The story told by Barbatos is inspired by a Syriac poem known as Hymn of the Pearl, where the King of Kings sends his second son to retrieve a pearl from a serpent in Egypt. The boy is later seduced by the Egyptians and forgets that he is the son of kings. But the story aside, I am particularly interested in this scene right here. A black serpent wrapping itself around the Genesis pearl. Since we are on the topic of pearls, let me introduce you to one very important pearl. This one. Have you recognized it yet? If not, then how about now? Yes, this is the sun, and yes, it is actually white. You see, the typical orange, red, and yellow depictions of the sun on the right that most people are familiar with are color-coded on purpose by astronomers to highlight specific features or temperature variations for the general public. But in reality, the sun emits light in all colors of the spectrum, and when you combine them, you get white light, meaning that the sun in truth is one enormous and very shiny pearl that is the source of all life. Make sure to remember what I just said about the Gnostic Chorus and the sun, as it's going to be very relevant throughout the video, because Natlan is the nation of fire, dragons, and war, and as you will see later, the sun happens to be quite important to all three of these. To fully understand the evolved Dragons of Natlan, we're gonna have to talk about the catalyst that prompted this wild conclusion, and out of all places, the item I am talking about is found inside the Tower of Gestalt during the world quest In the Wake of Narcissus. And it is a set of 3 keys that when combined form a disc with 3.5 circles called the root cycles. So, the Northern Croix Order divides history into a set of samsaras known as the root cycles, representing destruction and rebirth. And this is a perfect opportunity for me to draw your attention to these notes written by René de Petrichor. This is extremely important, especially the opening line, and I'll be coming back to it often in the future. However, for now, I am interested in what René states at the very end, where he mentions his quest to become a will powerful enough to protect, sustain, destroy, and create the world. Many of you should be familiar with this notion of creation, preservation, and destruction, as they are core pillars of Hinduism, designated by the Hindu gods Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva respectively. Alright, brace yourselves because we are getting into the spicy part. The opening phrase of René's notes reads, Io Io Pan, that which lies beneath the great sea. The phrase Io Io Pan originates from John Keats' poem titled Endymion. And Endymion in Greek mythology was a voraciously handsome shepherd from Elis who cut the eye of the moon goddess Selene and became her mortal lover. Their son happens to be none other than the hunter Narcissus, whose story inspires the entirety of the Northern Croix saga in Fontaine. While the subsequent phrase lies beneath the great sea comes from an ancient Sumerian text where it's read as Narayana, which happens to be one of the names of the Hindu god of time and preservation, Vishnu, who is also known as the Sustainer. Now, the Tower of Gestalt where all of this is found is also known as the Tower of Ipsissimus, which comes from a Lemurian concept describing a will powerful enough to create, sustain, and destroy the world. Going back to René's notes, such a will is dubbed as a descender, and throughout history there have been 4 descenders on Teyvat, which perfectly brings us back to the root cycles, because guess what? There also happens to be 4 of those samsaras. Those being the Hyperborea, symbolizing the loss of paradise and the frozen wasteland, Natlantine, symbolizing the triumph of humanity over the evil dragons, Remuria, symbolizing sin and rebirth, and the current samsara of Crown Arya, symbolizing freedom from the gods. This leads me to suspect that the end of each samsara is brought about by the arrival of a will powerful enough to destroy the world and usher in a new one, where the Hyperborea corresponds to the heavenly principles, Natlantine to the second who came, Remuria to the third descender, and Crown Arya, which is a funny way to say Kanria, to the traveler. Anyway, I am sure that many of you are still wondering why I spent so much time discussing the Northern Croix Ordo's root cycle, because so far it doesn't appear to have much to do with either Klee or the Dragons of Natlan. Well, it's about to. You see, most of what we know about the people of Natlan comes from 2 sources. The prologue of the manga with the children of Murata along with the description of the talking stick Claymore. However, for the purposes of this video, I want to focus on 2 characters, Ixbalanque and Iansan. And although we don't know what Ixbalanque looks like, he is likely to be draconic in origin. Here's why. The first time we hear about him is in Nouvelette's character introduction, where he is dubbed as the one entombed with primal fire. This primal fire is most likely of similar properties to the primordial sea, which means it originates from the light realm of the dragons and it belongs to the pyro dragon sovereign, just as the primordial sea is controlled by Nouvelette. By the way, this fire dragon sovereign might be called Kukulkan for the future reference. The name Xbalanque originates from the Mayan hero twins myth of Hanakpu and Xbalanque, which is a creation story that follows the journey of the twin brothers as they face the lords of the underworld and eventually become the moon and the sun, bringing light to the world. A tale symbolizing humanity's triumph over adversity and the cycle of life and death. Interestingly enough, the idea of a cycle of samsara symbolized by the destruction of the world and the birth of a new sun was central to most Mesoamerican civilizations. And just like the root cycles of Jacob's Narcincroy's Ordo, the Aztecs had an extremely similar belief in their cosmology. They thought that the world had gone through 4 eras or suns, as they called it, each ending in a catastrophic event. These events were often associated with the god's displeasure and the need for human sacrifice to maintain cosmic balance, with the current sun being Tunatyu, the 5th sun. And what's crazy is that the one who created the humans of the 5th world is none other than the serpent god Quetzalcoatl, whom I reckon most of you are familiar with or at the very least heard of before. No, seriously, this guy is like Zeus of Mesoamerica. He's extremely important. Keep in mind that although he is described as a feathered serpent god, Quetzalcoatl is basically a dragon. It's just that Mesoamericans didn't have such terminologies for dragons, but a giant, divine, flying, feathered serpent god is essentially the closest thing you can get to an American dragon. Look, this will make sense once I'm done explaining. According to the Aztecs, the 4th era ended with the sun being destroyed by a giant flood. At that point, there were no people on the earth because the giants had been killed and all the previous people were turned into monkeys, birds, and fish. So Quetzalcoatl went to the underworld and took with him Cihuacotl, a female goddess of fertility and life. And here I think most of you already know where this is going. Quetzalcoatl used the bones of the previous races to create mankind and then imbued their vessel with his own blood, giving them life. I am sure many of you have already connected the dots with the Primordial One and the Shade of Life. But hold on a second, I am not only talking about the Primordial One. You see, for those of you who watched my previous video about the Pale Princess and the 6 Pygmies, you probably remember me speculating that Egeria created the Oceanids by shedding the first tear and dissolving the carcass of Neuvillete's predecessor, the first Hydro Dragon Sovereign. This was based upon a metaphor found in the natural history excerpts which reads, "The lizard's bones dissolved into mud from which swans emerged." Now, when the Oceanids asked Egeria to transform them into humans, the Queen of All Waters failed to do so, for she lacked such authority and could only give them fake bodies using the waters of the Primordial Sea as a substitute for real blood. For the ability to create true human life was reserved only for the King and the Shade of Life. But the question remains, why can only they make true life? And the answer is that what Egeria was missing is something that she could never have to begin with. Because what the King and the Shade of Life did was use the bones of the defeated dragons of the old world to form human bodies and then imbued them with their own blood. And this explains why the wings of merciful, wrathful waters implies that humanity is made of materials alien to Tevat. It is because the blood in their very veins quite legitimately belongs to the Primordial One. But it doesn't end here. Towards the end of my previous video, I made another speculation that I didn't answer yet. Notice how both Egeria and Focalors, who were gods with Archon authority, failed to create true human life. Thus, Focalors realized that the only way to save the people of Fontaine would be to return the authority of water to the dragon Neuvillette, who can save them. And not only he could, but he did. Neuvillette, a dragon, managed to accomplish something that the gods could not: create true human life by giving the people of Fontaine real blood and cleansing them from the Primordial Sea. A dragon creating true human life when the gods could not. Now remember my whole thing about Quetzalcoatl is a dragon earlier? What I meant is that the Primordial One is also a dragon. Or is it? Well, keep this in mind. I'll get back to it by the end of this video. In fact, hold on. Stay right where you are. You see this? This right here? This is the Primordial One. Great. Now go back. More. Keep going. Yes, that's it right here. Perfect. This lady right here, this is the Night Mother and the second Who King. She became allies with the Primordial One and they turned on the third Descender. Now, move forward. I want to see the guy. Alright, yep, this is it. This is the third Descender. His name is the Prince of Light. Now you see this book right here, Records of Jueyon? He is the traveler from afar who is mentioned in the book, and his lover is a Sealy royalty, who, by the way, she's also the princess from the Pale Princess and the Six Pygmies. 30 days after their marriage in the Lunar Palace, the Great Calamity happened, the Moon Sisters killed each other, the Sealys were turned into wisps, and then heaven caught up to the couple, and then they wiped their memories and separated them for all eternity. And hey, you know what? Fuck it. Dainsleif is the third descender. And by the way, this isn't a prediction, this is a spoiler. There you go, Genshin is solved, we're done. I hope you had fun, bye. Well, not quite. The tone I employed just now was clearly sarcastic on purpose. Of course, I could still be wrong. But to avoid sounding like a complete idiot if I do turn out to be incorrect, I owe you guys an explanation of how I got here. Also, for the sake of simplicity, I am going to refer to the Abyss siblings as Lumine and the Traveler as Ether. Okay, it all starts with the Black Serpent from the Battle Pass. You see, I always had a feeling that this serpent is the King of Celestia, and this is before Enkanomiya came out, by the way. It was just a gut feeling that I had, and when Enkanomiya came out and before Sun and Moon book series was released, I became almost sure that the serpent is the king. This is because the Scribe of Ishtaroth states that the Primordial One may have been Phanes, and regardless of whether it is Phanes or not, it is certainly the snake, because Phanes himself in Greek mythology is depicted with a snake around him encircling the cosmic egg, which in Genshin is the Genesis Pearl. The snake itself is Phanes' mother Ananke, who is the Greek personification of fate and destiny. So either way, whether the Primordial One is Phanes, Kronos, or Ananke, it is the snake. However, I always had a major problem that prevented me from sharing my idea, which is the fact that the Black Serpent is a significant entity in Khaenri'ah, where the royal guards of the Eclipse dynasty were known as the Black Serpent Knights, and Khaenri'ah did not acknowledge the gods, so it would make absolutely no sense for them to adopt the literal king of the gods as one of their symbols. But then it hit me. If the Primordial One is a dragon that can create human life and is depicted as a black serpent encircling the Genesis Pearl, then what stops other descenders from being symbolized by snakes and dragons as well? After all, Dainsleif was the leader of the Black Serpent Knights, and his constellation is Ouroboros, which is a symbol of Egyptian origins that depicts a serpent or a dragon eating its own tail. Fun fact in chemistry, Ouroboros is what inspired the model for benzene molecule. Anyway, in Norse mythology, Ouroboros is Jormungandr, the world serpent that will usher in Ragnarok, which is the infamous end of the world in Nordic culture. And if you remember everything I said about the root cycles and how the end of each cycle is represented by the arrival of a new descender, then Jormungandr being Dainsleif is pretty on point if I would say so myself. This leaves us with one final missing piece to the puzzle, which is how to reconcile the fact that Dainsleif is a Khaenri'an human cursed with immortality. And that has already been solved. I talked about it in my previous video about Furina, since she is another human who was cursed with immortality. And Furina's curse came about as a result of Focalor splitting her divinity from body and soul. And here, remember what Dainsleif says during the Travail trailer.
Your journey has reached its end, but one final doorway remains. Step forth if you have understood the meaning of your journey. Defeat me, command me to step aside. Show me that you are worthier than I to rescue her. Then, the threads of all fate will be yours to reweave.
I want you to take a moment and visualize what's happening here. Why the hell is Dainsleif a human challenging Ether who is practically a god? In fact, why the hell is Dainsleif given so much spotlight in the story to begin with? I mean, think about it. Ether has already defeated so many beings across Teyvat that far surpass the most powerful humans. And by that point in the game, the Traveler will have defeated even mightier opponents. Yet somehow, at the very end, Dainsleif, out of all people, suddenly thinks that he, a mere human, can step up and challenge a will powerful enough to create, sustain, and destroy the world. Unless he too has a will that rivals an entire world. Listen to this.
The original calamity had been overturned, yet the island in the sky set the earth to burn. Chalk pursues gold. In this time inopportune, the eclipse is swallowed by the crimson moon. The future must atone for bygone mistakes, as the bond familiar falters and breaks, of the same blood, elders, and the youth. Such is the cycle of the world in truth. Dane, what is that strand of blonde hair to you? Someone you must kill, or the object of your penitence?
It is said in the records of Dwayun that the traveler from afar and the Seelie royalty were punished by heaven to be forever separated with their memories wiped out without a trace.
My memory has all but faded completely, but I will always remember how much she too loved these flowers.
This leads me to believe that what happened to Dainsleif is no different than what happened with Farina, with the exception of Dainsleif's divinity being seized by the usurpers and carved into chess pieces that became rewards for the victors of the Great War that followed. Once I realized what was actually happening here, this scene with Dainsleif and Aether became chilling to the bone. This is taking place at the very end of the story, with the third Descender, who once failed his mission, standing yet again in front of the Genesis Pearl. The story of his journey, of his tale to be told, and next to him stands the one who came to finish what he could not. A warrior who wields a sword that heralds the dawn and wears armor that can reflect the shining sunlight. This is the Prince of Light, challenging the Prince of the Abyss for the right to reweave the threads of fate. And man, will it be a battle to remember. One question that I assume many of you will ask is why Lumine calls Dainsleif a traitor and considers him her enemy. And the answer to this has to do with the legend of Saha. Now, I have already talked about it a few times before, and I'm going to talk about it for a very long time in the future. Because at this point, I am basically sure that Genshin Impact is the spiritual successor for the legend of Saha. Anyhow, in that game, the protagonist is called Misei Nanatsuki, and she goes on a quest to ask the gods to save her people from the destruction, only for them to mock her and kill her. Eventually, she reincarnates on Mount Sumeru and seeks to kill the gods in revenge, but fails every time, dying over and over again in an endless pagoda. In the end, Nana discovers that the gods had bound themselves to the world and that the only way for her to kill them would be to kill every living soul. She then fails and is forced to reincarnate and repeat her journey all over again forever. I imagine Dainsleif was forced with a similar ultimatum, where he regained some of his memories during his journey with Lumine. And if the Primordial One indeed created humanity using its own blood like Quetzalcoatl, then perhaps Dainsleif and the Abyss sibling were forced into a corner where they had to kill every living human first for a chance to defeat the Primordial One. An act that Dainsleif found too cruel, and thus betrayed Khaenri'ah and allowed for their destruction. This explains why Dainsleif dislikes the gods, but does not seek to hunt them down. All this to say that the Black Serpent of Khaenri'ah is none other than the third Descender, Dainsleif. Or is it? Well, not quite. Because while I do think that the Black Serpent Knights are named after their captain Dainsleif, I doubt that Dane is a Black Serpent in truth. And in order for me to explain why, we will have to go back to the Dragons of Natlan, starting with Iansan. Her name originates from an Orisha of the West African Yoruba called Oya, who is a female warrior spirit of storms and the dead. Later in Brazil, West African people developed a diasporic culture where Oya became known as Iansa, which is the obvious Latin American inspiration of Genshin's Iansa. The reason I am highlighting this is because Iansan is inspired by a divine African spirit, which further suggests that she is one of Natlan's evolved dragons, in addition to everything else I mentioned so far. Furthermore, just like I said at the start of this video, humanoid dragons with elf-like ears is nothing new within the Hoyoverse. Honestly, we can go even a step further. Reincarnating dragons with elf-like ears is nothing new within the Hoyoverse. In Genshin, our first encounter with such a concept takes place with Neuvillette, who is the incarnation of the Dragon of Water. However, despite possessing similar powers, Neuvillette says that he is a completely different person than the first Hydro Sovereign. Now, this is a perfect opportunity for me to talk about another long-lived species in the Hoyoverse, the Vidyadhara of Honkai Star Rail. As scions of Long the Permanence, the Vidyadhara are an immortal race that is blessed with the ability to self-reincarnate every 600 to 700 years. But what is fascinating for the sake of this video is the method through which they reincarnate. Once a Vidyadhara reaches the end of their natural lifespan or in response to significant injuries, they will come here to Skelegorge Waterscape, where they will enter a transformative event called molting, repairing their bodies inside draconic pearl-like eggs from which their reincarnation hatches with a new body and no memories of their past self. Vidyadhara Pearl Keepers tend to the eggs during this process, playing a vital role in assisting and protecting the newly reborn individuals. The Vidyadhara originate from a region in the waters of the ancient sea known as the Rolling Deep, on an unnamed ocean world. In ancient times, they possessed the ability to use powers derived from Long, allowing them to shapeshift creatures as easily as children playing with molding clay, again dragons creating. However, they eventually lost control of these powers, leading to a drastic shift in their environment. The once friendly creatures turned hostile, fish became toxic, sea beasts attacked, and even microorganisms posed a threat, making survival in their native oceans untenable. Fleeing from the dangers of their homeworld, the Vidyadhara later became a significant member race of the Xianzhou Alliance, and the entire delve of Skelegorge Waterscape on the Lawfu, including the waters of the Lunar Sun Depths, was said to have been brought over from their original world. The most gifted of the Vidyadhara will manifest draconic traits on their bodies, such as horns, tails, or minor skills as symbolism of their strength and wisdom. Such members are called High Elders, and are guided, advised, and educated by the preceptors, with the newest High Elder being Bailu, created by the previous High Elder Danfeng. Alright, perfect. We reached the point in this video that will tie everything together, because what happened to Danheng and Danfeng is what I think is also going on with Dainsleif. But before I continue, I need to make it clear that I am fully aware that Genshin and Star Rail are two completely different stories and are at best only loosely connected through the imaginary tree. I know that they are not the same game, but the reason I am bringing this all up is that we can still draw valuable parallels between what is happening across Hoyoverse's games to certain commonalities between themes and messages that these stories have. Anyway, a lot of political bullshit happens on the Xianzhou Lawfu, which I won't get into in this video, and in the end, the former High Elder Danfeng is punished for his crimes, which include but are not limited to attempting to give the Vidyadhara sexual reproduction and creating a giant draconic beast that almost destroyed the entire ship. Danfeng is then subdued and forced to enter into an incomplete reincarnation, where his memories are completely wiped out and his power and connection with the permanence is sealed in a shackling prison, leaving behind only a humanoid Danheng. Now, I don't know about you, but this reminds me a lot of Furina and how the god Focalor split her divinity and imprisoned it inside the Oratrice Mécanique de la Liste Cardinale, which by extension is likely foreshadowing what happened with the third Descender, the Prince of Light, where his divinity was ripped out of him by the first and second Descenders during the calamity of the Moon Sisters, and then only his mortal body was left behind and discarded with no memories of his past, eventually becoming the Twilight Sword of Khaenri'ah, Dainsleif. Now, to answer my question from earlier, is the Primordial One a dragon? And why is Dainsleif, who I consider the Prince of Light from the Gnostic Chorus, a black serpent? I'm going to keep it nice and simple. Here's what I think is going on. The Primordial One is depicted as a black snake that stole the Genesis Pearl from the King of the Kingdom of Heaven. This king is most likely the representation of King Solomon, the son of David, hence why the gods are all named after the demons from the Lesser Key of Solomon. A snake and a dragon are both lizards, but while one represents majesty and power, the other represents trickery, sin, and malevolence, especially a dark snake. Also, please keep in mind that these whole snakes, dragons, and color comparisons I'm making are all just imageries and metaphors. Obviously, I'm not saying that the Primordial One and Dainsleif are snakes, but what I'm trying to get at is that a snake is basically just a really shitty version of a dragon, and the Primordial One is said to have wings and a crown, so it checks out. Dainsleif, after the cataclysm of the Moon Sisters, was judged guilty by the heavenly principles and deemed a sinner in the world of Teyvat, thus losing his divinity and becoming a serpent as well, at least metaphorically. So yeah, I think that the kingdom established amongst the heavens was also a kingdom of divine dragons. This would explain why certain characters like Morax and Alice are so important and knowledgeable about the events of history and the world in general. And believe it or not, this also explains why Morax is the god of gold. After all, remember what I said about Klee loving treasure. Dragons, they really love gold, you know. By the way, this is actually why I was wondering earlier if Klee hatched from an egg. And now, only one final question remains before I end all of this. Who are the Traveler siblings? They are Thor. Why? I suppose you're gonna have to wait for a future video for me to elaborate on this. But for now, we have reached the end of this one. And once again, just like in my previous video, instead of a conventional outro, I am going to use the last few minutes to discuss who I think is the Primordial One. To be honest, this is just me shooting in the dark and hoping that I don't miss, but at this point I believe that the Primordial One is an XP of Honkai's Kevin Kaslana. And just to be clear, I am not saying that he is Kevin Kaslana. I only mean that he is inspired by Kevin's design, partially at least. Since I was talking about serpents throughout this video, Kevin was part of an organization called World Serpent. Furthermore, we know that the Primordial One was androgynous in nature, and thus it split itself into 5 parts. In my opinion, 4 female shades representing the Feather, Flower, Sands, and Goblet artifact pieces, and the King representing the Crown of Logos. And I think that each part of the Primordial One represents a different version of Kiana Kasana from Honkai, with the King being Kevin. And look, there are a lot of similarities that make me suspicious of this. For starters, in Honkai Impact 3rd, Kevin Kasana has a Honkai Beast form where he takes on draconic features with dragon wings and scales and the iconic elf-like pointy ears that I talked about throughout this video. Additionally, as I said earlier, every defender represents a sun based on what I talked about with the Aztecs and the Root Cycle. Kevin happens to wield the might of An-Utu, a weapon that is the incarnation of the god of destruction that shines with the brightness of a supernova. And in his Honkai Beast form, Kevin literally has Paimon's hairpin on his forehead. I mean, come on, this is a given at this point. But only time will tell. Kevin could be Nebelung's XP for all we know. And speaking of time, my time is up and it's time for me to go, and this time will be the last time I say time in this video. So thank you all for watching, take care, and I'll see you in the next time.